a stranger. The door scraped open without warning. A man stepped inside, young and lean with dark hair pulled back from a weathered face. His guard's uniform was worn at the edges, marking him as low-ranking, but his brown eyes held an unexpected gentleness as they settled on her. "You're awake," he said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might shatter her. He carried a wooden bowl and a blanket folded over his arm. "I'm Kale, Border Patrol. I found you last night on the northern edge, half frozen in the snow." Celine opened her mouth to respond, but the words died. What could she say? She knew nothing. Not where she'd come from, not why she'd been there, not even her own name. Kale seemed to understand her silence. He set the bowl on the floor, some kind of thin broth with chunks of meat floating in murky liquid, and draped the blanket across her shoulders. The warmth was almost painful. "Alpha Fenris will want to see you soon," he said. "He'll ask questions. Your pack, your lineage, your purpose here. If you can't answer—" He trailed off, but his expression finished the thought. "It won't go well for you." "I don't remember anything," Celine whispered, surprised by the sound of her own voice, hoarse and unfamiliar. Kale's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the door, then crouched beside her. "Then tell him that. Don't lie. He'll smell it." He hesitated, something flickering across his features, recognition perhaps, or grief. "Whatever happens, keep your head down. Blood Moon Pack doesn't tolerate weakness, and a wolf without a pack—" He stood abruptly. "Eat. You'll need your strength." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone. The Alpha's hall was built from ancient timber and stone, its ceiling lost in shadow. Torches lined the walls, casting savage light across the faces of wolves who watched Celine stumble forward, still wrapped in Kale's blanket. At the far end, seated on a throne of carved obsidian, Alpha Fenris regarded her with eyes like winter ice. He was massive, his shoulders broad enough to block the firelight behind him, his graying hair pulled into warrior's braids. Power radiated from him in waves that made Celine's instincts scream to bow, to submit, to make herself small. Beside him stood a young woman who could only be his daughter. Where Fenris was all brutal strength, she was sharp elegance, dark hair cascading over a fur coat that looked far too expensive for practicality, red lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Her eyes, the same ice blue as her father's, fixed on Celine with undisguised contempt. "Name," Fenris commanded, his voice like grinding stone. I don't know," Celine managed. "Pack. I don't remember. Lineage." Celine's throat closed. She remembers nothing, father," the young woman interrupted, her tone dripping with theatrical pity. "Poor thing, probably hit her head running from whatever pack was smart enough to exile her." She descended from the dais with predatory grace, circling Celine like a wolf sizing up wounded prey. Look at her. No scent markers, no pack tattoos, not even a proper scar to prove she's ever fought for anything. She stopped directly in front of Celine, so close their faces nearly touched. "Astray." The word echoed through the hall. Murmurs rippled among the gathered wolves. In the Lycan world, there was no lower status than astray, a wolf without pack, without purpose, without worth. "Please," Celine said, hating the weakness in her voice. "You need to learn your place," the woman said sweetly. Then, to her father, "She can work for her keep, can't she? We're always short on servants." Fenris studied Celine with the interest one might show a broken tool. "If she can't prove her value, Kira, she'll be driven out when the snows come. Blood Moon doesn't carry dead weight." Kira's smile widened. "Oh, I'll make sure she proves very valuable." "Oh, father." The evening meal was a raucous affair, long tables packed with warriors and hunters, platters of roasted meat, barrels of mead opened and drained with abandon. Celine stood against the far wall in the rough servant's shift they'd given her, watching the pack celebrate their strength, their unity, their belonging. Everything she didn't have. "Stray!" Kira's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She stood at the head table, a silver goblet in one hand. "Come here." Every eye in the hall turned to watch. Celine's legs felt wooden as she crossed the space, keenly aware of the silence that fell in her wake. Kira waited until Celine stood directly before her, then lifted a bucket that had been hidden beside her chair, one Celine hadn't noticed. The water inside it was clouded with chunks of ice. "You must be thirsty," Kira said, and her voice loud enough to carry. "Let me help." She upended the bucket. Freezing water crashed over Celine's head, stealing her breath, soaking through her shift until it clung to her skin. Ice chunks clattered at her feet. Laughter erupted around the hall. Not all of it, Celine noticed dimly. Some wolves looked away, but enough laughed, enough smiled. Kira kicked a wooden bowl across the floor. Scraps and gristle skittered from it, coming to rest at Celine's feet. "Dinner is served," she announced. "Dogs eat from the floor, don't they?" Fenris watched from his throne, his expression unreadable except for the faintest nod of approval. This was a test, Celine understood, of his daughter's dominance, of Celine's submission. She could have fought. Some instinct told her she could have, that her body remembered things her mind had forgotten. But surrounded by 100 wolves, alone and nameless, what would fighting accomplish except a quicker death? So she knelt. She reached for the bowl with shaking hands, her wet hair dripping onto the stones, and ate the scraps while the pack watched. The meat was gristly and cold, but she forced it down because Kael had been right. She needed her strength. Kira's laughter followed her all the way back to her cell. That night, finally alone in the darkness, Celine closed her eyes and willed herself toward unconsciousness. Sleep came reluctantly, but when it did, it brought fire. She stood on a battlefield beneath a violet sky. Bodies lay scattered across scorched earth, wolves torn apart, their blood painting the ground black. And in the center of the carnage, she stood. Not as she was now, shivering and broken, but terrible and beautiful, and her eyes blazing with violet light, flames of the same impossible color dancing along her fingertips. Wolves knelt before her, thousands of them, heads bowed, voices raised in a chant she couldn't quite hear. Then the flames surged higher, consuming everything, the wolves, the battlefield, the violet sky, until only fire remained. Celine woke gasping, her cell still dark, her body drenched in sweat despite the cold. Her hands trembled as she stared at them in the faint moonlight, half expecting to see violet flames flickering there. But there was nothing, just skin, just cold, just a stray who didn't even know her own name. The fighting pit reeked of copper and sweat. Celine stood at its edge in the gray pre-dawn light, staring down at the sand below, dark and crusted with blood from last night's challenges. 3 wolves had fought for ranking, only 2 had walked out. "Well?" The overseer, a scarred female named Rena, tossed a brush and bucket at Celine's feet. "The Alpha expects the pit clean before noon training. Blood draws scavengers, and we can't have ravens circling during drills. Makes us look weak." Celine climbed down into the pit, the sand cold and damp beneath her bare feet. The brush was nearly worn to nothing, its bristles stiff with old gore. She knelt where the worst of it had pooled, a crater in the sand where someone had fallen and not gotten up quickly enough, and began to scrub. The work was brutal. Her shoulders burned within the first hour. The sand seemed to drink the blood rather than release it, forcing her to dig deeper, to scour harder. By the time the sun climbed high enough to burn off the morning frost, her hands were raw and bleeding, mixing her blood with the stains she was meant to erase. "Pathetic," Rena called from above. "My grandmother could work faster, and she's been dead 10 years. Celine didn't respond. She'd learned quickly that words only gave them more ammunition. Silence, at least, was armor of a sort. When she finally hauled herself out of the pit, the bucket sloshing with pink-tinged water, Rena was already walking away. "Alpha's chamber's next," she threw over her shoulder. "And don't touch anything that looks valuable. We hang thieves by their wrists from the North Tower. Takes 3 days for them to stop screaming." Fenris's private chambers occupied the citadel's highest floor, accessible only by a narrow spiral staircase that left Celine's legs shaking by the time she reached the top. Yeah, the room was vast and austere. Stone walls hung with weapons and pelts, a massive bed carved from dark wood, and a hearth large enough to roast a deer. Also, apparently, large enough to contain 3 days' worth of ash that no one had bothered to clean. Celine worked through the afternoon, sweeping ash, scrubbing floors, changing linens that smelled of smoke and dominance. Every surface seemed designed to remind her of her position, the grandeur of the Alpha's life versus the smallness of her own. She was reaching beneath a weapons cabinet when her fingers brushed something cold and metallic. A ring, silver and ancient-looking, with a strange symbol etched into its face. A wolf's head, surrounded by crescent moons. The moment she touched it, pain lanced through her skull. A flash of memory, there and gone. The same ring on her own finger, a moonlight catching its surface as she raised her hand to command, "What are you doing?" Celine spun to find Kira framed in the doorway, her expression glacial. "I was just—" Celine held up the ring. "I found this under—" Kira crossed the room in 3 strides and snatched it from Celine's palm. "You were stealing from the Alpha." "No, I wasn't. I saw you." Kira's voice was silk over steel. "Hiding it in your hand. Planning to sell it probably, or trade it for passage out of pack territory." She studied the ring, then slipped it into her pocket. "My father will hear about this. Please." The word tasted like ash. "I wasn't stealing. I swear." "Swearing means nothing without honor, Stray, and you have none." Kira leaned close, her breath hot against Celine's ear. "But I'm feeling generous today." "I do the rest of your tasks perfectly, and maybe I'll forget I saw anything." She left Celine trembling among the half-cleaned chambers, the weight of a false accusation settling onto shoulders already bowed by labor. Hauling water was the worst task of all. The well sat at the bottom of a steep hill, and the kitchen required 20 buckets before nightfall. Celine's arms screamed in protest as she made trip after trip, the rope handles biting into her palms, ice-cold water slopping over the rims to soak her clothes. On her 14th trip up the hill, her foot caught on a root. She stumbled, throwing out a hand to catch herself, and the bucket went flying. Water arced through the air in a crystalline spray before crashing down across a pile of linens, waiting to be delivered to the barracks. A week's worth of clean laundry. Ruined. Celine stared at the muddy disaster, her heart sinking. She hadn't seen the laundry pile. Someone must have moved it there while she was at the well. "Oh no," Kira's voice dripped false sympathy. "What have you done?" Celine turned to find Kira surrounded by a cluster of younger wolves, her usual entourage of admirers and sycophants. They must have been waiting, watching. The laundry hadn't been moved by accident. "I'll clean it," Celine said quietly. "I'll wash everything again." "You'll wash it?" Kira gestured to the mud-soaked pile. "That's warriors' dress uniforms, for tomorrow's ceremony honoring our border patrol. You think you can just wash out disrespect?" The gathered wolves murmured agreement. A few stepped closer, forming a loose circle. Celine felt the trap closing. "It was an accident." "Was it?" Kira tilted her head. "I'm studying Celine like a curious predator." "Or are you sabotaging pack duties because you're angry about your position? A stray bitter about serving her betters? That's not—" Kira moved suddenly, her foot shooting out to hook Celine's ankle. Already off balance from the stumble, Celine went down hard, her knees slamming into the mud beside the ruined laundry. Pain shot up her legs, bright and sharp. "Clumsy," Kira observed. "Just like your attempt to steal from my father." Celine looked up at her, mud-splattered and kneeling, and felt something cold unfurl in her chest. Not fear, not even anger. Something older, something that whispered she'd knelt before no one, that queens did not bow to spoiled children playing at power. But the voice was madness. She was no queen. She was a stray with no memory and no allies. And so she lowered her gaze and said nothing. And that, somehow, made Kira's expression darken further. "You won't even beg?" She grabbed a fistful of Celine's wet hair, yanking her head back. Won't cry? Won't show me you understand your place? Celine met her eyes, and for just a moment she let Kira see what lived behind her carefully maintained submission, the cold void where her memories should be, the dreams of violet fire, the certainty that this cruelty was temporary because something was coming. Kira's hand loosened. She stepped back as if she'd touched something hot. "Clean this up," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "All of it. And if one uniform isn't perfect by dawn, you'll spend tomorrow night in the ice house." She turned on her heel and strode away, her followers trailing behind like uncertain shadows. And Celine knelt in the mud until they were gone, then slowly gathered the soaked linens. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the effort of restraint. Some part of her had wanted to surge upright, to grab Kira's wrist and break. She crushed the thought. Madness. She was astray, nothing more. She worked until midnight, rewashing every garment by hand in the frigid laundry house, her fingers numb and fumbling. When she finally stumbled back to her cell, exhausted to the point of collapse, she found a cloth bundle waiting outside her door. Inside, bread, hard cheese, and a strip of dried meat. No note. But she knew Kael's kindness by now, recognized it in the careful way the food was wrapped to stay fresh. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, then collapsed onto her straw mattress. Sleep dragged her down like drowning. In this time the dream was sharper. She stood in a throne room carved from black stone, torches burning with violet flames that cast no smoke. Wolves lined the walls, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, all on their knees, heads bowed, and she sat on the throne. She felt it beneath her, cold stone against her spine, and looked down at her hands. They were her hands, but different, stronger, adorned with rings of silver and bone. On her head rested a crown that felt both familiar and alien, its weight both burden and birthright. A wolf approached, crawling forward on his belly. "My queen," he whispered. "The northern territories have fallen. The Vorath are—" She raised one hand and violet flames danced along her fingertips. "Then we burn them," she heard herself say, her voice carrying absolute authority. We burn them until nothing remains but ash and memory." The wolves began to chant. A single word, over and over, the sound building like thunder. "Regina, Regina, Regina." Celine woke with tears on her face, the words still echoing in her ears. She didn't know what it meant. But her hands, when she held them up in the darkness, felt wrong. Too empty, as if they were meant to hold something they'd lost. Something like a crown of bone and silver. Something like power. The hunting horn's cry echoed through the forest, signaling the pack's departure. Celine watched from the citadel's service entrance as warriors streamed through the gates, 50 strong wolves in their prime, weapons strapped to their backs, anticipation electric in the air. The seasonal hunt was tradition, a demonstration of Blood Moon's prowess and unity. Celine hadn't expected to be included. Strays didn't hunt with the pack, but Kira appeared beside her just as the gates were closing, a fox-like smile playing at her lips. "You're coming," Kira announced. "Someone needs to carry supplies." The supplies turned out to be a pack laden with rope, knives, and rendering tools, easily 60 pounds that dug into Celine's shoulders as she followed the hunting party into the pine forest. The wolves moved with fluid grace through the undergrowth, barely disturbing the frost-covered leaves. Celine crashed behind them like a wounded deer, her burden making stealth impossible. Kira glanced back periodically, her expression satisfied each time Celine stumbled. They tracked for hours, following the scent of elk through increasingly dense forest. The pack spread out in a practiced formation. Flankers. As drivers, ambush positions. Celine was ordered to wait in a clearing with 2 young wolves barely past their first shift, tasked with guarding the supplies no one actually needed guarding. When the kill cry rang out, triumph and bloodlust mingled in the sound. The young wolves abandoned their post to witness the takedown. Celine followed more slowly, the supply pack still strapped to her back. The elk was enormous, a bull in his prime, his rack spanning nearly 6 feet. He lay on his side in a trampled circle of bloody snow, his chest still heaving with final breaths. Fenris stood over him, one hand on the beast's neck, in a gesture that might have been respect. Around him, the pack celebrated, warriors clasping forearms, sharing water skins, already arguing over who'd landed the killing blow. Kira stood apart from the celebration, her fur coat pristine, not a drop of blood on her. She hadn't participated in the actual hunt, Celine realized. She'd watched from a safe distance. "Father," Kira called, her voice cutting through the revelry. "A magnificent kill! The ancestors would be proud." Fenris acknowledged her with a nod, then gestured to his warriors. "Field dress it here. We'll carry it back in quarters." "No need," Kira interrupted. She pointed directly at Celine. "The stray can carry it. She's been useless all day. Let her prove she's worth feeding." Silence fell across the clearing. Even the wolves who'd been laughing a moment before grew quiet, glancing between Kira and the massive carcass. "Kira," one of the senior hunters, a grizzled male named Corvus, spoke carefully. "That bull weighs near 400 pounds. It takes 3 strong wolves to—" "Then she'll struggle, won't she?" Kira's smile was sharp. "Unless she'd prefer to walk back empty-handed and explain to the pack why we wasted a kill?" It was a trap with no escape. Refuse and face punishment for disobedience. Fail and face humiliation for weakness. Celine understood the game now. Every interaction with Kira was designed to have only one outcome: Celine's degradation. She shrugged off the supply pack and approached the elk. Up close, it was even larger than she'd thought, its body still radiating heat, blood pooling beneath its magnificent head. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, that she'd be crushed under the weight. But another part, the part that dreamed of violet flames and bowing wolves, whispered, "Try." Celine gripped the elk's front and rear legs. As she braced her feet and lifted, the carcass rose smoothly, settling across her shoulders as if it weighed no more than the supply pack. She straightened, adjusting her grip, and felt only a manageable heaviness, substantial but not crushing. The clearing remained silent. Celine met Kira's eyes and saw shock flicker there, quickly masked by something darker. Fear, perhaps, or rage. "Well," Celine said quietly, "which way back to the Citadel?" The walk back was grueling despite the elk's surprising manageability. Celine's legs burned, her shoulders ached, but she kept pace with the main group, refusing to lag behind. Warriors gave her wide berth, shooting confused glances her way. She heard whispers, "Shouldn't be possible. Just a stray." Seen trained warriors collapse under less. Kira walked ahead, her spine rigid, and not looking back once. They were within sight of the Citadel gates when Kira finally stopped and turned. Her face was composed, but her eyes glittered with barely contained fury. "Put it down," she commanded. Celine lowered the elk carefully, grateful for the reprieve. Her muscles trembled now, the adrenaline that had sustained her beginning to fade. "You know what I see?" Kira addressed the gathered wolves, though her gaze never left Celine. A stray showing off, making a spectacle of herself, trying to draw attention, to make our warriors look weak by comparison. She stepped closer. "In Blood Moon, we value pack unity, not individual pride." "I was just doing what you—" Celine began. "Quiet." Kira's voice cracked like a whip. She looked past Celine to a massive wolf bringing up the rear of the party. The pack's enforcer, a brute named Torvin, whose job was maintaining discipline through violence. "She needs to learn humility. 20 strikes. Make them count." Torvin's expression showed no emotion as he approached, flexing his scarred knuckles. This was his function, to deliver pain without question, without mercy. "Kira, this is excessive," Corvus objected. "She completed the task you gave her, and made a mockery of it," Kira snapped. "Do you question my judgment, Corvus?" The older wolf's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. No one challenged the Alpha's daughter publicly, not if they valued their position. Celine stood still as Torvin positioned himself in front of her. She could run. The forest was right there, but they'd hunt her down, and the punishment would be worse. Better to endure and survive. Torvin's first strike caught her across the jaw, snapping her head sideways. Pain exploded through her skull, bright and sharp. The second blow crashed into her ribs, driving the air from her lungs. "This is wrong," something whispered inside her. "You are not meant to kneel. You are not meant to break." The third punch drove her to her knees. Blood filled her mouth, copper sharp. The world tilted, graying at the edges. Torvin raised his fist for the fourth strike and froze. Celine looked up at him through swimming vision and saw his face slacken with confusion. He was staring at her eyes. She felt it then, a coldness spreading from her core outward, like ice forming on a winter lake. Her skin prickled. The air around her grew suddenly, impossibly frigid, frost forming on the grass beneath her knees. Torvin took a step back. "What?" Celine blinked, and for just a heartbeat, as the world tinted violet. Through that strange filter, she saw power, swirling energy in the air around her, responding to her pain, her rage, her desperate need to make this stop. Ice crystals formed along her forearms, glittering like diamonds against her skin. The gathered wolves murmured in alarm. Several stepped back. Even Fenris leaned forward from his position near the gates, his eyes narrowed. "Continue," Kira said, her voice slightly shrill. When Torvin didn't move, she screamed it. "I said continue!" Torvin's training overcame his confusion. His fist came down again, catching Celine across the temple. The violet tint vanished. The cold receded. The ice crystals melted as if they'd never been. Celine collapsed fully, her cheek pressed against frozen earth, and heard Kira's voice from very far away. 15 more. Then throw her in her cell and lock the door." The beating continued, but Celine barely felt it. She was too busy trying to understand what had just happened. The cold, the ice, the violet light. The certainty, just for a moment, that she could have stopped Torvin's fist with a thought. When they finally dragged her back to her cell and dumped her on the straw mattress, she lay there shaking, not from pain, but from the memory of power. Fever took her that night, or something like it. She drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to tell dreams from waking. But one vision came with perfect clarity. She stood in a throne room of black stone, violet flames burning in sconces that lined the walls. Her hands, unmarked by beatings, strong and steady, rested on the arms of an obsidian throne. On her head sat a crown that seemed grown from the bones of ancient wolves, silver wire wrapped through eye sockets and around fangs, moonstone embedded in the metal. Wolves filled the hall, hundreds of them, all on their knees. Their voices rose in unison, a chant that made the stones themselves vibrate. Regina Mortis, Regina Mortis, Regina Mortis, Queen of Death. She stood from the throne, or was it herself standing? The boundary between dreamer and dream had dissolved, and raised one hand. Violet fire erupted from her palm, not burning, but cold as deep winter. The wolves bowed lower, foreheads touching stone. "Rise," she commanded, and her voice carried absolute authority. "Rise and remember. We are not sheep to cower before the Vorath. We are wolves. We are death itself, given form and purpose." The wolves rose as one, an eyes blazing with devotion and bloodlust, and the roar that erupted from their throats shook the throne room's foundations. "Regina Mortis! Regina Mortis! Regina Mortis!" Celine woke gasping, the name still echoing in her ears. Morning light streamed through the barred window. Her body ached everywhere, her ribs screaming with each breath, her face swollen. But her hands, when she held them up, were steady. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the pain and confusion and fear, something ancient stirred. Waiting. The great hall had been transformed. Banners in Blood Moon's colors, crimson and silver, hung from every pillar. The obsidian throne had been polished until it gleamed like dark water, and fresh pine boughs were woven through the rafters, their scent mingling with wood smoke and anticipation. The entire pack had gathered, and from the highest-ranking warriors to the Omega pups barely old enough to shift. Celine stood against the back wall with the other servants, her bruises from Torvin's beating now faded to yellow-green shadows. 3 days had passed since the hunt. 3 days of whispers that followed her everywhere. Whispers about the ice, the violet flash in her eyes, the impossible strength. Whispers that had reached Kira's ears. Alpha Fenris rose from his throne, and silence fell like a blade. He was dressed in ceremonial armor, black leather etched with silver wolf forms, a cloak of winter wolf pelts draped across his shoulders. Power radiated from him in waves that made even the strongest warriors lower their eyes. "Blood Moon Pack," his voice carried to every corner of the hall. "We stand at the threshold of a new era. For 23 years. And I have led you through war and peace, through lean winters and abundant hunts. I have given you strength, territory, and pride." He paused, letting the weight of his legacy settle over them. But even the strongest wolf must eventually pass the mantle to the next generation. A ripple of understanding moved through the crowd. This was the announcement they'd all been expecting. Fenris extended his hand, and Kira rose from her seat beside the throne. She wore a gown of deep crimson, her dark hair braided with silver thread, a circlet of polished bone resting on her brow. She looked every inch the future Alpha, beautiful, composed, powerful. But Celine, watching from the shadows, saw the tremor in Kira's hands before she clasped them behind her back, saw the tightness around her eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach them. "During the harvest moon 3 weeks hence, my daughter Kira will be crowned Alpha Heir," Fenris declared. "She will be tested as tradition demands. She will prove her worth through trial of strength, wisdom, and leadership. And when the moon reaches its peak, she will take the oath that binds Alpha to Pack and Pack to Alpha." The hall erupted in ritual howls, the traditional response to such an announcement. But Celine heard the variations in tone. Some voices carried genuine enthusiasm, others were merely dutiful, and a few, very few, held notes of doubt. Kira heard them too. Her smile became brittle, her posture rigid. After the formal ceremony ended and the pack dispersed into celebration, Celine tried to slip away to the kitchens, but a hand caught her arm, one of Kira's attendants, a sharp-faced female named Mara. "The heir wants to see you," Mara said, her grip painful. "Now." Kira waited in a small chamber off the main hall, her ceremonial finery already discarded on a chair. She stood at the window, staring out at the courtyard, where pack members mingled and celebrated. "Do you hear them?" Kira asked without turning. "The whispers? They think I don't notice, but I hear everything." She spun suddenly, her eyes blazing. "They doubt me. Question whether I'm ready, whether I'm strong enough." Celine remained silent, sensing that any words would be fuel to flame. "And do you know what they whisper about?" Kira advanced, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "A stray. A nobody with no name and no past, who lifted a 400-pound elk like it was kindling, who made ice form on her skin during a beating." She stopped inches from Celine's face. "What are you?" "I don't know," Celine said truthfully. "Liar!" The word was a hiss. "You're here to undermine me, to make me look weak before my coronation. Someone sent you, a rival pack maybe, or enemies of my father. No one sent me. I don't even know where I came from." Kira's slap cracked across Celine's cheek, snapping her head sideways. "I said don't lie to me." Her breathing came fast and shallow, panic threading through the rage. "In 3 weeks, I have to prove myself in front of the entire pack. I have to show them I'm worthy of being Alpha, and I can't do that if there's a freak servant making everyone question what strength even means." She grabbed Celine's arm and dragged her toward the door, shoving her into the corridor where Mara and 2 male guards waited. "Take her to the ice house. Lock her in. 2 days. No food. No fire, no blankets. Let's see if she can make ice when she's freezing to death." "Kira, please," Celine tried. "It's Heir Kira to you, Stray. And when you come out, if you survive, you'll remember that." She nodded to the guards. "Take her." The ice house sat at the northern edge of the Citadel compound, a stone structure half buried in the hillside where the pack stored winter provisions. Inside, the temperature hovered just above freezing even in summer. In late autumn, it was a tomb of cold. They threw Celine inside and barred the door from the outside. Darkness swallowed her immediately, absolute and disorienting. The floor was smooth stone, slick with moisture. The walls wept with condensation that would freeze solid by nightfall. Celine curled into the farthest corner, wrapping her arms around herself. Her thin servant's dress provided no protection. Already she could feel the cold seeping into her bones, making her muscles clench and her teeth chatter. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning in the darkness. The cold became everything, an entity with weight and intention, pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath. She drifted in and out of consciousness, hypothermia's early stages making her thoughts sluggish and strange. In her delirium, she saw flashes of violet fire, heard the chanting, Regina Mortis, Regina Mortis, felt the weight of a crown that should have frozen solid, but instead burned cold as starlight. The scrape of the bar being lifted jolted her awake. The door opened a crack, spilling moonlight across the floor, and a figure slipped inside. Kael. He carried blankets bundled under one arm and moved quickly, kneeling beside her in the darkness. "Don't speak," he whispered, wrapping the first blanket around her shoulders. "The guard rotation changes in 5 minutes. I have to be gone before then." Celine clutched the blanket, her fingers too numb to grip properly. Kael wrapped the second one around her legs, then pressed something into her hands, a cloth bundle that radiated warmth. "Stones from the kitchen hearth," he explained quietly. "They'll stay warm for a few hours. Hide them under the blankets when I leave." "Why?" The word came out cracked and hoarse. "Why do you help me?" Kael's hands stilled. In the faint moonlight, Celine saw his profile, the strong jaw, the weathered face, the sorrow etched into the lines around his eyes. "Because I made a promise to someone I loved," he said finally. "Oh, someone I failed." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "I swore I'd protect her, that I'd stand between her and anything that meant her harm, and when she needed me most, I wasn't there." "What happened to her?" Celine asked. "She disappeared." Kael stood abruptly, as if the words hurt to speak. 3 years ago. There was a battle, chaos, fire, death everywhere. When the smoke cleared, she was gone. No body, no trace, just gone. He moved toward the door, then paused. "I've been searching ever since, and until I find her, or find proof she's dead, I help people who can't help themselves. It's the only way I can live with what I failed to do." He slipped out, and the bar scraped back into place, leaving Celine alone with warmth slowly returning to her limbs and questions multiplying in her mind. That night, wrapped in stolen blankets with heated stones pressed against her ribs, Celine dreamed. But this time, the dream had a face. She stood in a training yard, watching warriors drill in formation. Beside her stood a young man in armor marked with unfamiliar symbols, a wolf's head surrounded by crescent moons, the same symbol she'd seen on the ring in Fenris's chambers. The man was younger than Kael, but with the same strong features, the same intense eyes. "My queen," he said, bowing his head. "The northern battalions are ready for your inspection." "Thank you, Captain," she heard herself say. Her voice carried authority, warmth, trust. "Your diligence honors the crown." The young man, no, Captain Kael, her mind supplied, smiled. "My life for yours, Regina, always." The scene shifted. The same face, older now, wearing a royal guard's ceremonial armor. He knelt before her throne, head bowed, as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Rise, Commander Kael," she said. "You have proven your worth 100 times over. I trust no one more than you." "And I will follow you into death itself if you command it," he replied. The dream fractured then, dissolving into violet flames and screaming and a battlefield where everything fell apart. Celine woke with tears frozen on her cheeks and a certainty settling into her bones like ice. She knew Kael, or she had, in a life she couldn't quite remember. And whatever promise he'd made, whoever he'd loved and lost, somehow it was connected to her. Celine survived the ice house, though the 2 days left her weakened and hollow-eyed. When the guards finally released her, she could barely stand, and they deposited her in the kitchens with instructions to resume her duties immediately, as if she hadn't just spent 48 hours on the edge of death. The head cook took one look at her and shoved a bowl of hot broth into her trembling hands. "Drink! You're no good to anyone dead!" The woman's gruff kindness was the closest thing to sympathy Celine had experienced from anyone except Kael. As she sipped the broth, warming herself by the kitchen fire, she noticed an old woman watching her from the doorway. The healer, old Mara. The pack called her that to distinguish her from Kira's attendant who shared the name. She was ancient by wolf standards, her hair white as fresh snow, her face a map of wrinkles earned through decades of tending the pack's sick and injured. Old Mara's eyes, sharp and knowing, studied Celine with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Then the healer turned and disappeared down the corridor. Over the next 3 days, Celine noticed changes in the Citadel's atmosphere. Kira appeared at meals with increasing irregularity, and when she did show, her behavior was volatile, laughing too loudly one moment, flying into rage the next. During a minor disagreement with one of her attendants about the placement of coronation banners, Kira had screamed until her voice went hoarse, then burst into tears and fled the hall. The pack whispered more openly now. Even Fenris seemed concerned, though his solution was to dismiss Kira's episodes as pre-coronation nerves and increase her training regimen. Celine witnessed one of these training sessions from the servants' gallery overlooking the practice yard. Yet Kira faced off against Corvus, the grizzled hunter who'd objected during the elk incident. It should have been a straightforward sparring match. Kira was skilled, well-trained, fast. Instead, it was chaos. Kira attacked with reckless aggression, leaving herself open to counters she should have seen coming. When Corvus landed a controlled strike to her shoulder, meant to teach, not harm, she shrieked in fury and launched herself at him with killing intent. It took 3 warriors to pull her off, and even then she fought them, spittle flying from her lips, eyes wild. Fenris watched from the yard's edge, his expression unreadable. He didn't intervene, didn't comfort his daughter when she finally collapsed, sobbing. He simply turned and walked away. Old Mara found Celine that evening in the laundry house, where she was scrubbing linens in water so hot it scalded her hands. The healer entered quietly and barred the door behind her. "I need to speak with you," Mara said without preamble. "But first, tell me, how long have you noticed the heir's behavior changing?" Celine wrung out a sheet, uncertain how to answer. "Since I arrived, she's been intense." "Intense." Mara's laugh was bitter. "Diplomatic of you, but I'm asking about escalation. The mood swings, the paranoia, the inability to control her temper." "The last week or so," Celine admitted. "Since the coronation announcement, it's gotten worse." Mara nodded grimly. "Because Fenris increased her dosage." At Celine's confused look, the healer continued. "For the past 6 months, the Alpha has been adding blackroot to Kira's evening tea. Small amounts at first, enough to heighten aggression, to eliminate doubt and hesitation. He thought he was shaping her into a ruthless leader. Horror crawled up Celine's spine. He's poisoning his own daughter? He sees it as strengthening her. Mara's hands trembled with barely contained anger. Blackroot in small doses can enhance dominance behaviors, but sustained use destroys emotional regulation, amplifies insecurities, creates paranoid delusions. It's turning her into a monster, and he's too blind to see it, or worse, he doesn't care. Why are you telling me this? Because someone needs to know the truth. Mara moved closer, her voice dropping. I confronted Fenris this afternoon, showed him the evidence, the vials I found in his chambers, the symptoms I've observed in Kira. He denied everything. Said I was a senile old woman seeing conspiracies where none existed. What will you do? Warn Kira. Make her understand what her father has done. Mara's jaw set with determination. She deserves to know why she's losing her mind. Celine wanted to argue that Kira would never believe it, that the Blackroot-induced paranoia would make her reject any accusation against her father. But Mara was already heading for the door, conviction in every step. Celine heard the screaming an hour later. It came from the great hall, Kira's voice raised in incoherent fury. By the time Celine reached the corridor outside, half the pack had gathered to witness the spectacle. Through the crowd, she glimpsed old Mara on her knees, Kira standing over her, face twisted with rage. "Dare accuse my father of such betrayal!" Kira shrieked. "He has given everything for this pack, for me, and you spread lies about poison? I'm trying to help you," Mara pleaded. "Child, you must listen. I am not a child." Kira kicked the vial that had rolled across the floor. The evidence Mara had brought, it shattered against a pillar. "You're a traitor. You've always been jealous of my family's strength, and now you try to undermine me before my coronation with these delusions." Fenris stood beside his throne, arms crossed, watching. His expression showed no emotion as his daughter condemned the healer who'd tended the pack for 40 years. "Exile her," Kira commanded. "Strip her of her position. I want her beyond our borders by nightfall, and if she ever returns, she'll be executed as a traitor." "Kira, please!" Mara's voice cracked. "Guards!" They came immediately, and hauling the old healer to her feet. Mara didn't fight. She simply looked at Kira with profound sadness, then let them drag her toward the doors. As they passed near Celine, Mara's eyes found hers. The healer stumbled, forcing the guards to pause, and in that brief moment leaned close enough to whisper, "You are not what they think. The moon remembers you, even if you don't." Then she was gone, pulled through the doors and into the courtyard beyond. Celine stood frozen as the crowd dispersed, Mara's words echoing in her mind. "The moon remembers you." What did that mean? She was a stray, a nobody, a servant with no memory and no identity beyond what this pack had assigned her. How could the moon remember what she herself couldn't recall? But even as she questioned it, something stirred in her chest. A recognition, faint but undeniable. And she looked up through the hall's high windows at the waxing moon, still 2 weeks from fullness, and felt a pull she couldn't name, like the moon was watching her, waiting for her, knowing her. That night, she couldn't sleep. The dreams that usually came, the throne room, the violet flames, the chanting wolves, stayed frustratingly out of reach. Instead, she lay awake staring at the moonlight streaming through her cell's barred window, turning Mara's words over and over. "You are not what they think." The pack thought she was weak, broken, powerless, a stray to be pitied at best, tormented at worst. But she'd lifted an elk that should have crushed her. She'd made ice form on her skin during a beating. She dreamed of crowns and thrones and wolves calling her Regina Mortis. What if Mara was right? What if she wasn't what they thought? And then what was she? The answer came 3 days later, but not in the form she expected. Celine was hauling water again, her permanent assignment, it seemed, when she noticed Kale standing near the well, pretending to inspect the rope mechanism, but clearly waiting for her. She approached cautiously. They hadn't spoken since the ice house, though she'd caught him watching her several times, his expression troubled. "You asked me why I help you," Kale said quietly, not looking at her. "I told you I made a promise to someone I loved, someone I failed. I remember. There's more." He finally met her eyes, and she saw fear there, fear and desperate hope. "The woman I loved, the one I failed to protect. She had your eyes, violet when her power was active, gray when she suppressed it." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And she had your face." Celine's bucket slipped from her hands, water sloshing across her feet. "That's impossible," she breathed. "Is it?" Kyle stepped closer. "Is it really? You appear with no memory during a full moon, the same moon cycle that marks 3 years since she disappeared. You display strength that shouldn't exist in a common wolf. You create ice, her signature manifestation." His hands gripped her shoulders. Celine wasn't a name I chose at random. It was her name, the name she bore before she took the crown. What crown? But even as she asked, she knew. The dreams had shown her. The Lycan crown, Kael said. The crown of Regina Mortis, the true queen of all Lycan kind. The crown that's been empty for 3 years. In the distance, the moon hung pale in the afternoon sky, and Celine felt it watching her, waiting, and remembering everything she'd forgotten. The alarm howl tore through the pre-dawn darkness, not the ceremonial kind used for hunts or gatherings, but the desperate primal sound that meant blood and death. Celine jerked awake in her cell, heart hammering, as the citadel erupted into chaos. Boots thundered past her door. Warriors shouted orders. Steel rang as weapons were drawn from the armory. She pressed her face to the barred window, straining to see the northern perimeter where torches bobbed and flickered like dying stars. More howls rose, some cut off mid-cry in ways that made her stomach clench. An hour passed before the all-clear sounded. By then, the eastern sky had turned gray with approaching dawn, and Celine could smell it on the wind. Blood, char, and something else. Something wrong, a scent like burnt metal and rotting flowers that made her skin crawl. When the servants were finally released from their quarters, Celine followed the others to the great hall where Fenris had called an emergency assembly. The Alpha stood before his throne, his armor scored with fresh claw marks, his face darker than she'd ever seen it. 3 shrouded bodies lay on the stone floor. "The northern watchtower was hit 2 hours before dawn," Fenris announced, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled fury. "A coordinated strike, fast, surgical, devastating." He gestured to the bodies. Mikkel, Soren, and young Petra, gone before they could even trigger the full alarm. The attackers left no bodies of their own, no blood trail, nothing but these. He nodded to Corvus, who stepped forward carrying a cloth bundle. The old hunter unwrapped it carefully, as revealing 3 objects that made the assembled wolves recoil. Arrows, if they could be called that. The shafts were bone white, almost luminescent, and the tips gleamed with a substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Vorath," breathed one of the eldest warriors, a scarred female named Thorn who'd fought in the Great War. Her face had gone ashen. "But that's impossible. They were destroyed. We hunted them to extinction." "Clearly not," Fenris snapped. He lifted one of the arrows, his hand visibly trembling. "I thought them a ghost story told to frighten pups. But I was there, in the final battles of the Great War. I saw what they could do." He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of his strongest warriors. "If the Vorath have returned, we face an enemy unlike any you've encountered. They don't fight like wolves, as they're hunters who see us as prey." Kira stood beside her father, her face pale, but her jaw set. The Blackroot's influence was evident in the tightness around her eyes, the way her fingers twitched against her sides. "Father, surely this is just a remnant, a few survivors seeking revenge. We can hunt them down." "Scouts don't travel alone," Thorn interrupted. "The Vorath sends scouts before armies. They probe defenses, test responses, identify weaknesses." She stared at the arrows with something close to horror. "If we saw 3 scouts, there are 30 more we didn't see. And if there are 30 scouts—" She didn't need to finish. The implications hung heavy in the air. Fenris began organizing the defense, doubled patrols, reinforced watchtowers, rotating guard shifts to prevent fatigue. Yet the War Council formed a tight cluster around the Alpha, debating strategies and deployment. Celine stood among the servants against the far wall, listening. As they discussed patrol routes and defensive positions, something built inside her chest. Pressure, urgency, wrongness. The strategies they proposed were inadequate, dangerously so. She could see it clearly, as if someone had drawn a tactical map in her mind and marked all the weaknesses in glowing red. "We should concentrate forces at the northern approach," Corvus was saying. "Fortify the main gate." "No." The word escaped Celine's lips before she could stop it. The hall went silent. Every eye turned to her. "What did you say?" Fenris's voice was dangerously quiet. Celine's mouth had gone dry, but the knowledge burning inside her wouldn't be contained. Concentrating forces at one point. It's what they want. The Vorath don't attack strength. They attack from unexpected angles, exploit gaps, turn your own defensive positions into traps. And how, Kira's voice dripped with venom, would a stray servant know anything about Vorath tactics? I don't know, Celine pressed a hand to her temple, where memories flickered just out of reach. They hunt in packs of 7, always 7. 3 to draw attention, 2 to flank, 2 to kill. If you mass your warriors at the northern gate, you'll be vulnerable everywhere else. They'll hit the eastern wall where it meets the forest, where the watchtower's sightline is blocked by the old pine stand. Thorn had gone very still. How do you know about the pine stand's blind spot? The same way I know they'll come just before moonrise is when the light changes and depth perception fails. The same way I know those arrows are tipped with Shadow's Bane, a poison that prevents healing and makes wounds burn like acid. The words poured out of her now, unstoppable. You need mobile units, not static defenses. 3 wolf teams with crossbows and silver core bolts. Position them in rotating patterns so the Vorath can't predict. Enough! Kira's scream echoed off the stone walls. She descended from the dais like a storm, her face contorted with rage and something that looked like fear. You dare interrupt a war council? You dare speak of tactics like you're some kind of commander? She grabbed Celine by the throat, slamming her against the wall. You're a stray, a nobody. You have no right to speak, no right to even be in this hall. Kira, Fenris said, his tone warning. Boss, release her. She's undermining me. Kira's grip tightened. First the elk, now this, pretending to know things she couldn't possibly know, making me look weak in front of the pack. I wasn't trying to. Kira's fist crashed into Celine's stomach, doubling her over. Take her to the square, Kira commanded the guards. Public whipping, 50 lashes for speaking out of turn in the Alpha's presence. Kira, that's excessive, Corvus began. I am the heir. Kira whirled on him, and Celine saw it clearly now. The poison working through her system, magnifying her insecurities into paranoid rage. And I will not tolerate insubordination from a servant who thinks she knows better than trained warriors. Fenris said nothing. He simply watched as the guards seized Celine's arms. They bound her to the whipping post in the central square, saw wrists secured above her head, back exposed. A crowd gathered, some eager for the spectacle, others visibly uncomfortable. Celine spotted Kale near the back, his face anguished, one hand on his sword hilt, as if debating whether to intervene. Don't, she tried to communicate with her eyes. You'll only make it worse. Torvin took up the whip, the same enforcer who'd beaten her after the hunt. The leather was braided and tipped with metal, designed to cut skin and leave lasting scars. 50 lashes, Kira announced from the platform where she stood with her father. Let this be a lesson to all who forget their place. The first strike fell across Celine's shoulders, laying open skin in a line of fire. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. The second strike crossed the first. Blood began to flow. By the 10th, Celine's vision had started to gray at the edges. By the 20th, she'd stopped counting. And by the 30th, something inside her broke. Or awakened. The cold came first, spreading from her core like ice through water. Her skin temperature plummeted so rapidly that condensation formed on her back, turning to frost in seconds. Torvin drew back for the 31st strike. The whip fell and shattered against her back like glass against stone. Celine heard it crack, heard Torvin's grunt of confusion. She looked over her shoulder and saw him staring at the whip's handle, from which only shredded leather strips remained. The braided cord had crystallized on contact with her skin, frozen so thoroughly it had disintegrated. Her back, where it should have been ribboned with cuts, it was instead covered in a thin layer of ice that glittered in the afternoon sun. Blood still flowed from the earlier wounds, but the ice seemed to be sealing them, numbing the pain. The crowd had gone dead silent. What? Kira stepped down from the platform, approaching slowly. What is this? Celine felt the cold intensifying, spreading down her arms to her bound wrists. The ropes began to frost over, fibers crackling as ice crystals formed along their length. "She's using power," one of the warriors breathed. "But that's not possible. Strays don't have—" "She's no stray." Thorn's voice cut through the confusion, filled with a mixture of wonder and recognition. "I've seen this before. Ice manifestation, violet eyes, impossible strength." The old warrior went to one knee, her head bowed. "In the Great War, I fought under her banner. And I saw her freeze entire battalions, saw her eyes burn violet as she commanded the Lycan armies." "What are you talking about?" Fenris demanded. Thorn raised her head, and her eyes shone with tears. "The Regina Mortis, the Lycan queen, she disappeared during the war's final battle. We thought her dead." She looked directly at Selene. "But she stands before us now." Selene's wrists flexed, and the frozen ropes snapped like dry twigs. She turned to face the assembled pack, ice still glittering on her skin, and felt something vast and ancient stirring in the empty places of her memory. The moon, though not yet visible in the daylit sky, seemed to pulse with recognition. And somewhere deep inside, a name echoed. Regina Mortis, Queen of Death, Selene. They locked Selene in her cell immediately after the ropes shattered. As before the crowd's shock could turn to questions, Fenris ordered guards posted outside her door with instructions that no one was to speak to her until he decided what to do with a servant who might be something far more dangerous. But Kael had always been skilled at moving unseen. He came through the window 2 hours after nightfall, dropping silently from the roof into her cell. Selene sat against the far wall, her torn shift still crusted with dried blood, though the wounds beneath had sealed themselves with ice that was only now beginning to melt. "We don't have much time," Kael said, producing a leather satchel. "The guard rotation changes in 20 minutes. He knelt beside her, pulling out clean cloth and a clay jar of salve. "Let me see your back." Selene turned. And his sharp intake of breath told her it was worse than she'd thought. His hands were gentle as he cleaned the wounds. The deeper ones had already scarred, tissue knitting together at an impossible rate, but the edges were angry and inflamed. "This shouldn't be healing so fast," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Even with your power returning, this kind of regeneration—" He trailed off, applying the salve with careful precision. Selene let him work in silence for a long moment. Then, "Who am I?" His hands stilled against her back. "Who am I, Kael?" She turned to face him, ignoring the pull of half-healed wounds. "Not what I might be. Not what people suspect. The truth. You know it. You've known it since you found me in the snow. So tell me." Kael's expression crumbled. 3 years of searching, of hoping, of failing. It all showed in the lines of his face as his resolve finally broke. "Your name is Selene Keldris," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are the true Lycan queen, Regina Mortis, Queen of Death, and I—" He swallowed hard. "I was commander of your royal guard." The words should have felt like revelation, but instead they settled over Selene like something remembered, like coming home to a house she'd forgotten she owned. 3 years ago, Kael continued, the Great War reached its final battle. The Vorath had pushed deep into Lycan territory, slaughtering entire packs, burning strongholds. They were winning. We were losing. His hands trembled as he set aside the salve. "You called your war council, your advisors, your generals, your guard. You told us you'd found a way to end it." "What way?" Selene asked, though part of her already knew. "A sealing ritual, ancient magic, forbidden magic, that could trap the Vorath in a dimensional prison. But the cost—" Kael's voice broke. "The cost was everything. Your memories, your power, your very identity. The ritual would scatter you across the veil, strip away everything that made you you, leave you vulnerable and alone." Selene felt cold dread pooling in her stomach. "But I did it anyway." "You said it was the only way to give Lycankind time to rebuild. 3 years. That's how long the seal would hold. 3 years for the packs to unite, to prepare, to become strong enough to face the Vorath when they inevitably broke free." Kael met her eyes, his own wet with unshed tears. "We begged you not to. Your guard, we swore we'd find another way, that we'd fight to our last breath rather than lose you." But you'd already made your decision. What happened during the ritual? Chaos. The Vorath sensed what you were doing and launched a full assault on the ritual site. We held them off, barely. I watched you stand in the center of a circle of ancient stones, watched violet flames consume you, watched as your power tore a hole between dimensions and dragged the Vorath army through. His voice dropped to barely audible. And then you were just gone. The flames died. The stones went dark. There was no body, no trace, nothing but your crown lying in the ash. Celine touched her head unconsciously, feeling the phantom weight of something that should be there. "The seal also stripped your royal scent," Kael said. "It's what marks a true monarch, a scent that all Lycans instinctively recognize and submit to. Without it, you became unrecognizable, just another wolf." He laughed bitterly. "We searched everywhere, every pack, every territory, every forgotten corner of Lycan lands, but you'd vanished completely. Until I appeared at Blood Moon's border." "The night the seal was set to break," Kael confirmed. 3 years to the day after you disappeared. I was on patrol when I found you. Blonde hair, gray eyes, no memory. I knew. Even without your scent, even with your power dormant, I knew." He gripped her shoulders. "You have a scar on your left shoulder blade shaped like a crescent moon. You were born during a lunar eclipse. Your mother's name was Celeste, and she died defending you when you were 7. These aren't things I could know unless you served me." Celine reached up, touching the back of her left shoulder where, yes, and a crescent-shaped scar had always been. She'd noticed it in the servants' bathing area, wondered vaguely where it came from. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" she asked. "Because forcing the memories could have shattered your mind completely. The ritual didn't just hide them. It locked them away behind barriers that had to break naturally, triggered by necessity or emotion." Kael's expression turned anguished. "I watched you suffer, watched Kira torment you, and every moment I stayed silent felt like betrayal. But I had to wait for your power to return on its own, for the memories to surface when they were ready." "The dreams," Celine said. "The throne room, the violet flames, the wolves chanting Regina Mortis, those were real memories. Trying to break through, getting stronger as the seal weakened and your power returned." He stood, pacing the small cell. "That's why you could lift the elk, why you manifested ice during the beating, why you knew Vorath tactics. You're remembering piece by piece." "The Vorath scouts," Celine breathed. "They're here because the seal broke. 3 years have passed, and the dimensional prison has shattered." Kael turned to her, his face grave. "The scouts are just the beginning. The full Vorath army will follow, and this time there's no seal to save us, no ritual to trap them." He knelt before her again, taking her hands. "You are Celine Kaeldris, the Lycan queen, and the war is about to begin again." Celine looked down at their joined hands, his scarred from battle, hers marked with fresh wounds that were healing impossibly fast. She felt the truth of his words resonating in her bones, and felt memories pressing against the barriers in her mind like water against a cracking dam. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now?" Kael's smile was grim. "Now you remember who you are. You reclaim your power, and you do what you were born to do, lead the Lycan nation against an enemy that wants us extinct." He squeezed her hands. "But first we have to survive long enough for you to fully awaken. Because Kira sees you as a threat. Fenris doesn't know what to make of you. And in less than 2 weeks, the harvest moon rises." "The coronation," Celine said. "The coronation," Kael agreed. "Where Kira will be tested, where the pack will expect their new leader to prove her worth. And where, I suspect, the Vorath will make their true move." Outside, boots thundered past, the guard rotation changing. Kael moved toward the window. "Wait," Celine called. "My crown. You said it was left behind after the ritual. Where is it?" Kael paused, silhouetted against the moonlight. Hidden, waiting for the queen to return and claim it. He climbed onto the windowsill. Rest, my queen. Your body needs to heal, and your power needs to stabilize. The real battle is coming. Then he was gone, leaving Celine alone with the truth and the weight of a crown she couldn't yet remember wearing. The harvest moon rose bloated and crimson over Blood Moon Citadel, larger than Celine had ever seen it. The color was wrong, not the gentle orange of autumn harvest, but deep red, like fresh spilled blood. Even the pack's most superstitious members tried to dismiss it as atmospheric phenomenon, dust in the upper air, nothing more. But Celine felt the wrongness in her bones. And they'd kept her locked in her cell for the past week, ever since the whipping post incident. Fenris had declared her under observation pending investigation, which meant isolated, guarded, and forbidden contact with anyone except the servant who brought her meager meals. Even that servant wouldn't meet her eyes, terrified of whatever Celine had become. Only Kael visited, slipping through her window each night to bring news and continue her education. He told her stories of her reign, battles won, treaties forged, enemies crushed beneath her violet flames. With each story, fragments of memory surfaced like bodies floating up from deep water. A throne room, a crown, the weight of absolute power and the loneliness it brought. But the memories remained incomplete, frustratingly out of reach whenever she tried to grasp them directly. Tonight, they'd finally released her. Not out of mercy, but because Kira had demanded all pack members attend her coronation, even the stray servant, who might be a queen. Celine stood at the very back of the gathered crowd, flanked by 2 guards who'd been instructed to keep her away from the ceremony's center. The entire pack had assembled in the Citadel's grand courtyard, nearly 300 wolves, from elderly Thorn leaning on a carved walking stick to pups barely old enough to attend their first major ceremony. The courtyard had been transformed. Torches ringed the space, their flames dancing in a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The Alpha's ceremonial platform had been draped in crimson and silver, and at its center stood the Alpha's crown, an ancient thing of silver and wolf bone. It is said to have been worn by the first pack leader 1,000 years ago. Kira ascended the platform as drums began their rhythmic thunder. She wore ceremonial armor of blackened leather and fur, her face painted with traditional war marks, slashes of red across her cheeks, a crescent moon on her forehead. She should have looked magnificent, powerful, ready to lead. Instead, Celine saw a young woman barely holding herself together. The Blackroot's damage was evident in Kira's 2 bright eyes, the slight tremor in her hands before she clasped them behind her back. The way her jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped. Fenris stood beside the crown, his expression proud and blind to his daughter's deterioration. "Blood Moon Pack," his voice carried across the courtyard. We gather under the harvest moon to witness the next generation claim their birthright. My daughter Kira has proven herself through trial of strength, wisdom, and leadership. Tonight, she takes the oath that will bind her to you and you to her, until death claims one or all. The pack howled their approval, though Celine noticed some voices were less enthusiastic than others. Kira stepped forward, kneeling before her father and the crown. She began the ancient oath, her voice steady despite the trembling Celine could see in her shoulders. "I pledge my strength to Blood Moon, my wisdom to guide my—" The sky went dark. Not the gradual darkness of clouds crossing the moon, but instant, absolute blackness that swallowed the crimson moonlight like a candle snuffed. The torches guttered and died simultaneously. Wolves cried out in alarm, their instincts screaming danger as primitive fear rippled through the crowd. Then the shadows began to move. They came from everywhere at once, pouring from the forest, rising from the ground itself, materializing from darkness that shouldn't exist. Hundreds of them, moving with inhuman speed and silence, the Vorath. Celine had seen them in her fragmentary memories, but seeing them now, solid and real and hunting, was different. They were humanoid, but wrong, too tall, too thin, their skin pale as corpse flesh and their eyes absolutely black. They wore armor of bone and carried weapons that seemed to drink light. At their head walked a figure that made even the other Vorath seem small. The pale general stood nearly 8 feet tall, his armor ornate and ancient, his face beautiful in the way a carved marble skull might be beautiful. When he spoke, and his voice carried it across the courtyard like winter wind through a graveyard. "Blood Moon Pack, how quaint." He surveyed the assembled wolves with amusement. "You gather to crown a pretender, while the true queen hides among you like a rat." His black eyes swept the crowd, and Celine felt his gaze pass over her without recognition. Her royal scent still dormant, her power still locked away. 3 years we waited in the dark between dimensions, 3 years of hunger, of plotting, of preparing, and now the seal has broken, and we have returned to finish what we started. "Attack!" Fenris roared, and the pack erupted into action. Warriors shifted mid-leap, fur and fangs replacing human form as they threw themselves at the Vorath line. Steel met bone weapons with sounds like breaking glass. Blood sprayed, red and black mixing in the dirt. And the Vorath moved like water, like shadow, like nothing Celine had ever seen. For everyone that fell, 3 wolves died. Their bone weapons ignored armor, cutting through leather and flesh with equal ease. The black substance coating their blades, Shadow's bane, Celine's memory supplied, prevented wounds from healing, turned minor cuts into fatal bleeding. Kira stood frozen on the platform, the crown forgotten at her feet, watching her pack die. The pale general cut through the melee with contemptuous ease, his blade trailing shadow as it separated wolves from their lives. He was searching, Celine realized. His head turned methodically, black eyes scanning faces, looking for something specific, looking for her. "We know you're here, Regina Mortis," he called over the sounds of battle. "We can feel your power stirring, even muted as it is. The seal may have stolen your memories, but it couldn't hide you forever." He grabbed a young warrior by the throat and lifted him effortlessly. "Where is the queen? Tell me, and I'll make your deaths quick." The warrior spat blood in the general's face. The pale general smiled and snapped his neck. Celine felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice fracturing under spring thaw. Power flooded her veins, cold and vast and terrifyingly familiar. Her vision tinted violet. The air around her began to frost. One of her guards grabbed her arm. "Don't. You'll only draw their attention." The Vorath spotted the movement. 3 of them broke from the main assault, racing towards Celine with impossible speed. Their weapons rose, Shadow's bane glinting in the returning torchlight as someone managed to relight them. Kyle appeared from nowhere, his blade meeting the first Vorath's strike in a shower of sparks. "Run!" he shouted at Celine, already engaging the second attacker. But Celine couldn't run, couldn't move, because as the third Vorath's blade descended toward her heart, memories crashed through her mind like a tidal wave. A throne room burning with violet flame, a crown of bone and silver, an army of thousands bowing before her, the weight of absolute power and the loneliness of command, the ritual that tore her apart to save her people. And her name, her true name, echoing across 3 years of silence, Celine Caeldris, Regina Mortis, Lycan Queen. The Vorath blade fell toward Kael's exposed back as he fought off 2 attackers, his movement slowing from blood loss and exhaustion. He wouldn't see it coming, wouldn't be able to block, as something inside Celine didn't crack. It detonated. Every memory hit at once. The throne room where she'd commanded armies, the battlefields where she'd burned entire battalions to ash, the ritual chamber where she'd sacrificed everything to save her people. The faces of those she'd loved, those she'd lost, those she'd led into death, knowing it was necessary. 3 years of compressed history, power, identity, all of it slamming back into her consciousness with the force of a collapsing star. She was Celine Caeldris, Regina Mortis, the Lycan queen who had never knelt, never bowed, never surrendered, and she would not watch her commander die. Enough! The word came out wrapped in power that made the air itself shatter. Her eyes ignited, not a flicker, Not a flash, but an explosion of violet light so brilliant it turned night to day. As the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single heartbeat, ice erupted from the ground beneath her feet in massive jagged pillars, spreading outward in a wave of crystalline devastation. The pillars grew with impossible speed, 20 feet high, 30, impaling Vorath mid-strike, lifting them off the ground as frozen spears tore through armor and flesh. The three attackers closest to Kael were caught mid-leap, their bodies suspended on pillars of ice that had grown through their chests. The Vorath blade falling toward Kael froze solid in midair and shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. The entire courtyard, 300 wolves and hundreds of Vorath, went utterly silent. Selene rose, though she didn't remember standing. Power flowed through her like a river finding its course after a drought, and familiar and terrifying and right. Her blonde hair lifted on an ethereal wind that touched nothing else, each strand seeming to glow with captured moonlight. Frost spread from her footsteps, intricate patterns forming on the stone, on the walls, on the very air around her. She looked at her hands and saw violet flames dancing along her fingertips, cold fire that burned with the chill of absolute zero. Her skin had taken on an otherworldly quality, pale and luminous, as if she were carved from moonlight and ice given form. The broken memories reassembled themselves. She remembered everything. The pale general stood 50 feet away, his black eyes wide with an emotion Selene recognized instantly. Terror. Pure, absolute terror. "No," he breathed. "You were lost, scattered across the veil. The ritual should have—" "The ritual lasted exactly as long as I designed it to." Selene's voice carried across the courtyard, not loud, but impossible to ignore. It held layers, the weight of command, the cold of deep winter, the absolute certainty of someone who had ruled nations. 3 years, long enough for the seal to hold, long enough for my power to return when I needed it. She began walking forward. Wolves scrambled out of her path, not from fear, but from instinct. Every Lycan cell in their bodies recognized what she was, even if their minds didn't understand yet. The ice pillars rang like bells as she passed, resonating with her power. "You know what I am," Selene said, her violet eyes fixed on the pale general. "You've always known. That's why you came here tonight, not for Kira's pretender crown, but for mine. How you thought if you found me weakened, scattered, you could consume my power before I remembered how to use it." The temperature continued to drop. Wolves began to shiver. Breath formed clouds in the air. The blood on the ground froze into abstract patterns. The pale general took a step backward, the first time Selene had ever seen one of the Vorath retreat. "You made one critical mistake," Selene continued, and now ice began forming in the air around her, crystalline geometries that defied physics, fractals of frozen power that spun slowly like deadly snowflakes. "You assumed the ritual weakened me, that scattering my memories, my power, my very identity across 3 years would diminish what I am." She raised one hand, and the ice formations accelerated, spinning faster, growing larger. "But I am not diminished by sacrifice. I am defined by it." Violet flames erupted along her other arm, crawling up her shoulder, wreathing her in cold fire. "I am Regina Mortis, Queen of Death, the last daughter of the Eclipse, and I have been patient long enough." Her voice rose to a command that shook the Citadel's foundations. "You will kneel before your queen." The words hit like a physical force. The pale general's knees buckled, not from choice, but from the absolute authority in her voice. Ancient Lycan magic, the power that had bound the first packs to their leaders, roared through the command. Even without her crown, even after 3 years of silence, the Regina's voice could not be denied. The pale general crashed to his knees, his face contorted with rage and terror. Behind him, the entire Vorath army followed, hundreds of them dropping simultaneously, as their weapons clattering to the frozen ground. Blood Moon Pack stood transfixed. Kira stared from her platform, the forgotten crown at her feet, her painted face slack with shock. Fenris had gone very still, his alpha authority suddenly feeling small and provincial in the presence of true royalty. Kael alone smiled, blood running down his face from a dozen cuts, and went to one knee by choice. "My queen," he said, his voice breaking with relief and joy. "Welcome back." Selene stood in the center of the frozen courtyard, violet flames and ice swirling around her, her power fully awakened at last. She looked at the kneeling Vorath, at her shocked pack, at the crimson moon hanging overhead like a watchful eye. Then she looked at the pale general and let him see what lived behind her eyes. 3 years of suffering, of humiliation, as of being treated as less than nothing. 3 years of remembering, piece by painful piece, exactly who and what she was. "You came to finish what you started," she said softly, and somehow that was more terrifying than her earlier shout. "So let's finish it." She clenched her fist, and every Vorath in the courtyard screamed as ice began forming inside their veins. The Queen of Death had returned, and she was done being merciful. The ice spreading through Vorath veins stopped just short of their hearts. Selene held them suspended in agony, not killing, but demonstrating absolute control over their lives. The pale general's face had gone gray, frost forming at the corners of his black eyes. "Please," he gasped, the word foreign to his tongue. "Mercy, Regina, we only sought survival." "Survival." Selene's voice was cold as the void between stars. "You slaughtered entire packs, burned strongholds, hunted my people like animals, and you call that survival?" "The seal condemned us to dimensional prison, a place of no light, no warmth, no sustenance. We fed on shadows and our own dying for 3 years." The pale general's pride cracked, revealing something almost like desperation beneath. "When the seal broke, we had a choice: fade into nothing or fight for our place in this world again." Selene felt the truth of his words resonate. The seal had been necessary, but not merciful. She'd trapped thousands of beings in a hell dimension and told herself it was justice because they were the enemy, the same logic Kira had used when she locked Selene in the ice house, and the same logic Fenris used when he poisoned his own daughter. Cruelty justified by necessity, weakness punished as strength. "You can kill us," the pale general continued, "or seal us again. Sacrifice your memories once more, scatter yourself across the veil, buy another 3 years. The ritual still exists in the old texts. You could perform it tonight under the harvest moon." The offer hung in the air like a blade. Selene felt the pack's eyes on her, waiting for their queen to make the hard choice, to sacrifice herself again for their safety. "No!" Kael's voice cut through the tension. He pushed himself upright despite his wounds, blood still dripping from the gash across his ribs. "There's a third path, my queen. One you couldn't see 3 years ago because the war had made you too focused on victory at any cost." Selene turned to him and saw in his eyes the young commander who'd begged her not to perform the ritual, who'd pleaded for another way. "The Lycan nation is fractured," Kael said, addressing not just Selene, but the entire assembled pack. Hundreds of independent packs, each jealous of their territory, their autonomy, their pride. We're strong individually, but weak collectively. That's why the Vorath nearly won. They fought as a unified force while we fought as scattered tribes. He moved to stand beside Selene, his voice growing stronger. "But you, the true queen, can unite them, not through conquest or fear, but through what you've demonstrated these past weeks. Resilience, mercy despite suffering, protection of the weak even at cost to yourself." He looked directly at the Blood Moon wolves. Every pack in Lycan territory will have heard whispers by now. And a stray who lifted impossible weight, a servant who survived the ice house, a nobody who knew battle tactics she shouldn't know. They'll hear that the Regina Mortis has returned, and they'll come. To kneel or to challenge? Fenris spoke for the first time since Selene's awakening, his voice carefully neutral. "To choose," Selene said, the answer arriving with certainty. "The same choice I'll give the Vorath. Serve a unified Lycan nation, contribute your strength to our collective survival, or face extinction. She looked at the pale general. You want a place in this world? Earn it. Fight beside us instead of against us. Prove that you're more than just parasites feeding on stronger beings. The pale general's expression shifted through shock, calculation, and finally something like hope. You would trust us? And after everything? I would give you the same chance I'm giving myself, Celine said. A chance to be something other than what the war made us. She released the ice from their veins. The Vorath gasped collectively, rubbing circulation back into frozen limbs. The pale general remained kneeling, studying Celine with new eyes. But first, Celine turned to face Alpha Fenris and his daughter. We address the rot within our own house. Fenris straightened, his hand moving instinctively toward the blade at his hip. Careful, Regina. You may be a queen, but this is still my territory. Is it? Celine's voice cut like winter wind. Tell me, Alpha Fenris, what gives you the right to rule? Strength? You're strong. Wisdom? Questionable, given what you've done to your daughter. She began walking toward the platform where Kira still stood frozen.
Or perhaps it's cruelty you value most, the ability to inflict suffering without remorse. I have led this pack for 23 years.
By poisoning your own child. The words fell like stones into still water. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kira's head snapped up, her painted face suddenly vulnerable. Blackroot, wasn't it? Old Mara discovered your crime before you had her exiled for daring to speak truth. Fenris's face darkened. My daughter needed to be strong. She needed to be trusted. Celine's power flared, violet flames dancing along her shoulders. You saw her kindness as weakness, her doubts as failure. So you poisoned her mind, amplified her worst instincts, and called it love. She stopped at the base of the platform. You created the very monster you feared she wasn't ruthless enough to become. Kira's hands trembled at her sides. Father? It was necessary, Fenris said, but his voice lacked conviction. You were too soft, too emotional. I was making you into the alpha blood moon needed. You were making her into you, Celine interrupted, and look where that led. A daughter so consumed by insecurity that she tormented the one person who could have been her greatest ally. She climbed the platform steps until she stood face to face with Kira. But I don't blame you, not entirely, because I know what it's like to have poison in your veins, literal or metaphorical, making you into something you're not. Kira's eyes glistened with tears that cut tracks through her war paint. I'm sorry, she whispered, for the ice house, the beatings, the humiliation. I saw my own weakness reflected in you, and I couldn't bear it. I know. Celine's voice softened. You have a choice now, Kira. Continue your father's legacy. Rule through fear, through cruelty, through the belief that strength means never showing mercy. Or break the cycle. Learn what true power looks like. She gestured to the frozen courtyard, to the kneeling Vorath, to the awed pack. I was powerless for weeks. Beaten, starved, degraded, and yet I survived. That's strength, Kira. Not domination, but endurance. Not cruelty, but resilience. Kira looked at her father, then at the crown lying forgotten at her feet. She picked it up slowly, the silver and bone heavy in her hands. Then she knelt and offered it to Celine. This was never meant for me, Kira said, her voice breaking. I see that now. I was trying to earn something I didn't deserve by becoming someone I hated. She met Celine's eyes. Teach me, please, teach me what real strength looks like. Celine took the crown, not Kira's pretender crown, but the symbol of choice it represented. She turned to address the entire pack, her voice carrying across the courtyard. I am Celine Keldris, Regina Mortis, true queen of Lycan kind. I have been dead for 3 years and reborn in suffering. I have remembered who I was, and I have chosen to become something more. She raised the crown high. This is not the reign you remember. I will not rule through fear or dominance. I will not sacrifice the weak to protect the strong. My reign begins with a promise. No Lycan will suffer in silence again. She placed the crown on her own head, and it felt different than she remembered.
Not a burden, but a responsibility willingly accepted. The Vorath have a choice: serve or fall. Blood Moon Pack has a choice: join the unified Lycan nation or remain isolated and weak. Every pack across our territories has the same choice. Her violet eyes blazed. The war begins again tomorrow, but this time we fight not as scattered tribes, but as one people. This time we win not through sacrifice, but through unity. The pale general rose slowly. I pledge the Vorath to your service, Regina. We will fight beside you, not against you. Kale unsheathed his blade and laid it at her feet. The royal guard returns to its queen. One by one, the Blood Moon wolves knelt, not from compulsion, but from choice. Even Fenris, his pride crumbling under the weight of his failures, bent his knee. Only Kira remained standing beside Celine, a tear streaming down her face. Kneel with them, Celine said gently. Tomorrow you rise as something new. But tonight, you acknowledge what you were. Kira knelt, and Celine placed a hand on her head in benediction and forgiveness.